We can classify the poems in this selection under study according to their thematic concerns. This will help to give a prompter or a lead to the students to guide them on what they expect from each poem and how the poems can be carefully selected to suit the various questions which they will be tested on. We have one, poems that deal with prayer and invocation. These are poems that are concerned with the supplication for pity to soften the suffering and burden of a people. These prayers are directed to heaven that controls all other human activities on earth. The plea could be concerning a drought, a desertic experience, as in the case of the desert, by Amin Kassam. The plants and the humans all pray to God to give them the precious liquid of water to quench their thirst. It is a desperate cry for rain to restore harmony and hope on the land. B or 2. We have poems of praise and glorification. These are poems that celebrate a person, an idea, or an institution for what they are or what they stand for. In His Excellency the Masquerade J.P. Clark praises, or his praises on the celebration of the Mask, which has a sacred spiritual significance to the Ojoto people of the Ijaw community, where Clark comes from. The mask symbolizes indigenous tradition and the mask being a symbol of spirituality. The human who wears the mask becomes a spirit, and the mask is the unifying factor across the bridge. That is the link between the living and the dead. In Martin Luther King by Amin Kassam, the praise is on the courage, vision, and hope for the future that emanated from the civil rights activist Martin Luther King for his fight of freedom for Black people in America. It should be noted, therefore, that his iconic speech at the Lincoln Memorial brought worldwide knowledge about the plight and the sufferings of the Black people in America and all over the world. The speech ignited some humanity to the consciences of those in power all over the world to support the Black cause, which later gave them some degree of freedom, such as voting, education, citizenship. The speech brought hope that one day people will be judged based on the principle of equality and not on the color of their skin. 3. These are poems that deal with indictment or criticism. These are poems that are focused on presenting formal charges or accusations for serious crimes committed by one group to another. In The Sounds Begin Again by Dennis Brutus, the poet exposes the crimes against humanity perpetrated by the South African apartheid regime. These crimes include brutality, arbitrary arrests, torture, and oppression. The racist regime had the impunity to arrest Blacks, torture them, and even kill them when they deemed necessary. Above all, Blacks were simply regarded as objects and second-class human beings. In At the Funeral, Brutus exposes the sorrow, the pain, and the tragedy that befalls Black families and communities because of the racist apartheid regime and their laws. This is captured through the killing or the death of Valencia Mujombozi, who had just graduated as a medical student or doctor. His death brings tragedy and dejection to a community that would have benefited from his knowledge. In Fragile, Chikaya Otamsi, the poet indicates the West or indicts the West for racism and bigotry, using the case of a young African American who was lynched during the period of racism in America. Blacks' lives do not matter to whites, and they believe that the Blacks do not deserve to share the same space with them. Consequently, lynching became the order of the day. and the poet overwhelmingly condemns such extravagant display of inhumanity to fellow human beings. The death of Emmett goes beyond personal pain as it is a collective pain for the black community. Mazizi Kunene picks up the indictment in the Screams, where he exposes the misery, pain, agony, and despair that is spread around and is the mode of operation of the apartheid regime. Arbitrary arrest and torture were the order of the day, and the blacks had been subjected to unknown pain and suffering. Lastly, Mbela Sone Dipoko denounces the apartheid regime for their inhumanity to blacks, whom they held in bondage in the heroic shields. Dipoko proposes that there should be an uprising from the Zulu people to gain back their nation and put an end to the economic exploitation of their natural resources by the Boers. The call also arouses the courage and bravery of the Zulu people and the extension the peoples of Africa to stand up against the oppressors to liberate themselves. 4. Poems that deal with man and nature. These are poems that glorify nature and see man as part of it. Lubega glorifies the setting of the sun in evening. The setting is symbolic of man's fading out of life as it is observed and perceived at different levels of the community. The poet uses the setting of the sun to make some very important statements about life and man in nature and man's relationship with nature itself. The death or setting of the sun is observed globally and by all classes of people. Next, we have love, compassion, and emotion. These are poems that deal with love for one another, be it at the communal or individual level. Flora by Jared Angira is about love at first sight and moral depravity that has engulfed women in the metropolis. Such women are lustful, sexually passionate, sensual, unfaithful, and promiscuous. Above all, the women put material consideration above everything else. These women, like Flora, hate the men they fall in love with because they are heartless and they push many men into infidelity as they seduce them with their bodies. We also have poems about black consciousness or the poet's passage. These are poems that are based on the philosophy of negritude. For example, Communion by Chikaya Utamsi advocates for loyalty and solidarity for the blacks' cause of freedom, independence, racism, and imperialism. The poem also seeks to reawaken a self-awareness of one's identity as against Western stereotypes and domination. He exposes the loss of dignity by the black man under the influence of colonialism. He is angry about black people who are so naive to accept who they are as defined by the white man rather than accept their real personality of being African. He challenges black voices that are submissive to the whites for them to wake up. We also have poems of patriotism and fatherland and freedom. These are poems that focus on the celebration of ancestral lands, such as Here We Are, in a different poem by Onesimo, and The Long Day's March. These are all poems that all advocate for freedom by Africans, but yet they make Africans to understand that freedom will not come on a platter of gold. It will be fought tooth and nail, and blood will be shed. We also have poems that deal with experience of living in exile, like Leaving the Country, where Tijani Bahadu exposes the trauma and pain that is felt by those who are in exile and the nostalgia to come back to their countries where they rightfully belong because they are homesick. Then we also have poems that deal with compatriot and humanity, such as Analogy, Mother Earth, Rulers, Upheavals, The Casualties, No Coffin, No Grave. And we also have poems that deal with the prison experience, such as Cold, which is a dehumanizing condition in which the prisoners are kept by their white captors. And lastly, we have ancestral worship in poems like Olukun, The Bond, and Eve. We also have black alienation in poems like Sellout, Listen Comrade, and The Right Road. With this classification, we